The market closed early now. That was the first thing you noticed if you arrived in Mos Espa without knowing what it had once been. The stalls folded before the second sun touched the horizon. The traders packed quickly, with the practiced efficiency of people who had learned that the time between dusk and full dark was not a time to be visible. They moved without being told to move. The habit had formed over several years of understanding, without anyone explaining it, that the streets after dark belonged to something that had not yet decided what it was. 15 years ago, the market did not close early. 15 years ago, the market in Mos Espa ran past midnight on the festival days. And on the ordinary days, it ran until the last trader had sold the last item worth selling. And the streets between the stalls were lit by lanterns strung between the awnings. And the noise of it carried all the way to the edge of the slave quarters on the west side of town. Not because Mos Espa was safe. It was never safe. Not in any sense that a core world citizen would recognize, but because there was a structure to the danger. Because the danger had a shape, and anything with a shape can be navigated if you learn it well enough and pay attention. The shape is gone now. What replaced it is not chaos exactly. Chaos would be simpler. What replaced it is competition. 3 organizations, at last count, each claiming the same routes, the same protection fees, the same authority over the same market stalls, none of them with the reach or the patience or the accumulated history to make their claim stick. Shall the traders pay all 3 when they have to? When they can't afford to pay all 3, they pay the one most likely to be standing in front of them on the day the payment is due. And they close early, and they move quickly through the streets after dark, and they do not complain out loud, because complaining out loud requires knowing who is listening and what they will do with what they hear. And in Mos Espa in 19 ABY, that is information nobody has reliably. The Outer Rim Bureau of the New Republic, in a report filed 2 years ago and not yet formally responded to, described Tatooine as a zone of transitional instability, consistent with the expected period of reorganization following the dismantling of criminal infrastructure. The Bureau noted that conditions were expected to stabilize as New Republic governance extended more fully into the Outer Rim territories. The moisture farmers who had been paying 3 protection fees instead of 1 and receiving protection from none of them with any consistency were not consulted in the preparation of that report. We should be precise about what we mean when we say that something is gone. There is gone as in finished. The way a fire is gone when the wood runs out and the heat dissipates, and what remains is cold ash that carries the shape of what burned. And there is gone as in removed. The way a stone is gone from a wall when it is pulled free, leaving a gap that the surrounding stones begin to shift toward, settling in new configurations around the absence, the whole structure changed by what is missing, even if, from a distance, the wall still looks like a wall. Mos Espa is the second kind of gone. From a distance, from the window of a transport approaching the planet, from the offices of a New Republic bureau on Coruscant, Tatooine looks the way it has always looked. Desert, 2 suns, the scattered architecture of a world that built itself out of necessity rather than design. The docking bays at Mos Eisley still receive ships. The market at Mos Espa still runs, at least until early evening. The moisture farmers still work their evaporators in the flatlands outside town, drawing water from an atmosphere that yields it reluctantly. But the stones are shifting, and anyone who stands inside the wall, rather than looking at it from a distance, can feel the movement. The water trade is where it is most visible. Under the arrangement that organized Tatooine's economy for nearly a century, moisture farmers in the territory between Mos Espa and the Dune Sea paid a tithe, 10% of their monthly yield, to a network of collection agents who answered to a central authority. In exchange, the routes between the farms and the market were maintained. Disputes over water rights were adjudicated, not by any formal legal system, because formal legal systems had never extended meaningfully to Tatooine's agricultural districts, but by a process of negotiation and enforcement that most of the farmers understood and could predict. When a Tusken raider band moved into the territory near the Jundland wastes and began raiding vaporator lines, a response was organized and the raiding stopped. When a drought year reduced yields below the tithe threshold, the tithe was adjusted. This is not a story about justice. The arrangement was not just. The 10% was not negotiated freely. The enforcement that protected the farmers was the same enforcement that collected from them, and nobody who paid the tithe was under any illusion about that. The farmers of the Tatooine flatlands knew exactly what they were part of, but they also knew how it worked. Now they pay 3 tithes to 3 different collectors, and when the Tusken Raiders moved into the Jundland territory, again last cycle, their 3rd incursion in 2 years, nobody organized a response. One of the 3 organizations sent 2 enforcers who turned back after the first day, because there was a dispute about whose territory the incursion had occurred in, and therefore whose responsibility it was to address it. Another organization filed a counterclaim on the territory itself, not to defend the farms, but to establish a jurisdictional precedent for their next collection round. The moisture farmers dealt with the situation themselves, the way they had before any central authority claimed the territory, the way their grandparents had, except their grandparents had not been paying 3 tithes simultaneously for the privilege of that arrangement. I want to be clear about something before we go further. This is not an argument that what existed before was good. It is not a case for a particular kind of order, or for the people who imposed it. The arrangement that organized Tatooine's economy for a century was built on fear and maintained by violence, and it extracted something real from peoples who had very little to give. The farmers who paid the tithe did not pay it freely. The workers who passed through Mos Espa's market did so with an awareness of what waited for them if they stepped outside the rules they had not written. There were people held in that palace in chains. There were people who died badly and were not mourned. All of this is true. But the New Republic's report, the one that described Tatooine as a zone of transitional instability, was written by people who understood that what they had dismantled was bad and had not yet had to reckon fully with what they had left behind. There is a kind of thinking that is very good at identifying what needs to be removed and not very practiced at asking what the removed thing was also doing. The question of what it was also doing is not a comfortable question, especially when the answers make a clean victory less clean. We will return to this. We will have to return to it, because the whole shape of what we are examining cannot be seen without it. For now, just hold it. The market closing early. The farmers paying 3 tithes for no protection. The stones shifting in the wall. The palace sits on the edge of the Dune Sea as if it grew there. That is the first impression it gives, and it is not entirely wrong. The rock formation that the original structure was built into is genuinely ancient. Tatooine's sandstone laid down in layers over millions of years, and each layer a slightly different shade of orange and brown, so that the cliff face reads like a geological record if you know how to look at it. The builders who first cut into it, the contemplative monks who established their monastery here approximately 700 years before the events we are discussing, chose this location because it was remote and because the rock formation provided natural defense without requiring any act of aggression to maintain. You could sit in this fortress and simply let the desert keep everything else away. The monks are still there. This surprises people when they learn it, and it is worth pausing on because it is relevant in ways that will become clearer later. The Bomar order, the monks who built this monastery, practice a form of contemplation that requires, at its highest stages, the removal of the brain from the body and its storage in a nutrient jar so that the practitioner can pursue thought uninterrupted by physical sensation. This is not a metaphor. The order maintains spider droid bodies that carry the nutrient jars through the lower passages of the monastery, so that the fully committed practitioners can continue moving through their world, slowly, in darkness, in passages too narrow for most species, while devoting the full capacity of their minds to the work of pure consideration. When the criminal organization moved into the upper levels of their monastery, beginning approximately 500 years before the events we are discussing, when the structure was first seized and converted, the Bomar monks did not resist. They retreated downward. They continued their work. The noise and the traffic and the violence and the music and the smell of smoke and cooking and unwashed bodies that moved through the levels above them. All of this was, from the Bomar perspective, simply more sensation to be filtered out. More evidence that the physical world was not the primary site of meaning. They are still filtering it out now. The Wike mercenaries, who currently occupy the upper levels, 14 of them, using the palace as a staging area for protection and transit operations in the surrounding territory, know that something moves in the lower passages. They have heard the sounds. One of them went down 2 levels with a lamp 3 years ago and came back up very quickly and would not describe in detail what he had seen. The group has an informal agreement that the lower passages are not their business. This is, as far as the Bomar monks are concerned, an entirely satisfactory arrangement. The upper levels carry 15 years of layered occupation. Under the Wike, a thin veneer of their own presence, cots, equipment, the smell of food cooked in portable units, graffiti in Huttese and in a dialect of Wiki script on the walls near the sleeping areas. Practical, temporary, the presence of people who know they are not staying. Under that, deeper, the residue of several years of contested occupation by smaller groups who moved through after the original organization's collapse. Some of them left marks. A Gamorrean clan that held the West Wing for 8 months left carvings in the stone near what had been the guards' quarters. A group of human scavengers who were there only briefly left nothing deliberate, but broke several things in the process of searching for valuables, and the breaks are still visible. Under all of that, deeper still, the layers that do not come off. The stone floor of the main throne room carries grooves worn into it by the passage of something very heavy across the same paths, thousands of times over decades. The grooves run from the entrance to the center of the room and then around the raised dais and back, the circulation patterns of something that moved in predictable ways, that had habits, that returned to the same places again and again across so many years that the stone eventually recorded it. The Wike do not use the throne room. It is too large, too open, and it has a quality they cannot articulate, a specific atmospheric density that none of them find comfortable for extended periods. They use the antechamber instead, which is smaller and does not have the grooves in the floor. The ceiling of the throne room still has the attachment points for the chains. The chains themselves are gone, taken in the scavenging years, sold for whatever their weight in metal was worth. But the attachment points remain, cut into the ceiling at regular intervals. And if you stand in the room and look up at them, you begin to understand something about the scale of what organized the space, what the room was designed to accommodate, what it was built to serve. There is also, and this is a small detail, but the small details accumulate, a smell in the throne room that does not leave. The Wike, who cleaned the space in the first weeks after they arrived, scrubbed the walls and the floor, and aired the room through the upper vents. The smell returned within a few days. It is not unpleasant, exactly. It is the smell of something very old. Older than the Wiki occupation, older than the scavengers, older than the last years of the original organization. It is the smell of stone that has been in the presence of a specific kind of smoke for a very long time. We will come back to that smell. We will understand what it was by the time we are done. Outside the palace, the dune sea. Tatooine's desert is not empty in the way that the word empty usually implies. Empty suggests absence. The dune sea is not absent. It is full of movement, full of process, full of the slow and continuous work of sand doing what sand does. The dunes shift, not dramatically, not visibly from moment to moment, but measurably over time. A formation that is in a particular place this year will be in a slightly different place next year. Over decades, the topography of the dune sea changes in ways that make old maps unreliable. The route from the palace to the great pit of Carcoon, 12 miles across open desert, the route that the sail barge Katana traveled in its last hours, is not a route that many people travel now. There is nothing at the other end that justifies the crossing. The pit itself is a geological feature, a sarlacc habitat, nothing more. The sarlacc does not care about human traffic. It is patient in a way that makes even the most patient criminals look impetuous. It has been in that depression in the sand for thousands of years and intends to be there for thousands more. The wreckage of the Katana is mostly gone. The initial explosion destroyed the central hull, and the fires burned for several hours after. What the fire did not take, the Jawas took in the days that followed, systematic and thorough as Jawas always are, moving through the debris field with their sandcrawler and stripping anything with material value. Within a month of the battle, there was very little physical evidence that a large vessel had burned there. Within 5 years, the sand had covered most of what remained. Within 15 years, now, in 19 ABY, the depression where the Katana came down is only barely visible if you know to look for it. A slight irregularity in the dune formation, a place where the sand seems slightly softer, slightly more willing to shift. If you did not know what had happened there, you would not pause over it. The pit of Carcoon itself is still visible. The sarlacc does not permit the sand to fully close over its mouth, maintaining its own clearing, through mechanisms that biologists who have studied the species can describe, but the desert itself does not seem to acknowledge. The pit is there. The sarlacc is there, as it has always been, waiting with the specific patience of a creature that measures time in centuries. Nothing marks the spot where the barge went down. No memorial, no marker, no plaque on behalf of any organization acknowledging what happened here. This is not surprising. The people who would have been most motivated to mark the spot were not in the habit of making memorials, and the people who celebrated the death that occurred here moved on to other things immediately and did not return. The New Republic has not marked it either. This is perhaps more interesting. 15 years is not a long time in historical terms. The great battles of the Clone Wars have memorials on a dozen worlds. The Battle of Yavin has a memorial. The Battle of Endor has a memorial. Even some of the smaller engagements of the Galactic Civil War have been marked in some way. A plaque, a historical register entry, a name day. The death at Carcoon is in the record. The victory at Carcoon is acknowledged. But nothing was ever placed at the site to mark it. Perhaps there is no version of such a marker that could be written straightforwardly. The language of victory memorials requires a clean narrative, and the events at Carcoon resist clean narrative in ways that even 15 years of historical processing have not fully resolved. There were people on that barge who were not enemies. There were decisions made that day that were neither heroic nor villainous, but simply expedient. There was a death at the center of the event that was, depending on how you measure these things, either justice or execution, or something else that does not have a single good word. The sand does not distinguish between any of these options. The sand covers everything with the same slow patience, the same indifference to significance. The pit of Carcoon opens its mouth to the sky, and the twin moons of Tatooine rise over the dune sea, and the desert says nothing about who or what is worth remembering, because the desert has never found a reason to say anything at all. Under the twin moons, the dune sea is a different color, orange in the day, fierce and saturated and aggressive in its brightness. Under the moons, it becomes silver grey and deep blue in the hollows of the dunes, the shadows falling at different angles than they do in the daytime, making familiar formations strange. Travellers who cross the dune sea at night and do not know it well have gotten lost in terrain they could have navigated easily in the day because the moonlight changes the shapes. In 4 ABY, in the hours after the battle above the pit, the survivors left quickly. They had good reasons to leave quickly. The desert was not safe, the night was coming, and there was a larger mission still in motion that required them elsewhere. They did not linger. They took their wounded, and their freed, and their dead, and they left the dune sea to do what it does. Nobody who was at the pit of Carcoon that day ever came back to stand at the place where it happened and think about it quietly. This is not a criticism. It is an observation. The people who were there that day had lives that did not permit much quiet thinking in the years that followed. There was a war still happening, and then the aftermath of the war, and then the work of rebuilding, which is its own kind of war with different weapons and different costs. The pit of Carcoon was something they survived, and the instinct of people who survive things is usually to move away from them rather than toward them. But it means that nobody ever recorded what those last moments looked like from within the event, what it looked like from the barge, from the deck, from close enough to see faces, what the sky looked like that day, what the air smelled like, whether anyone close enough to see said anything, or whether it was too fast or too loud or too much. The account of those last moments, such as it exists, is assembled from fragments, from people who were present but looking elsewhere, who were fighting for their own survival and not observing, who remembered what they saw through the filter of everything that came after. What nobody recorded is what the center of the event looked like, who was close enough to see clearly. What they saw, the sand knows. The sand was there and the sand covered it, and the sand keeps what it keeps. We are left, at the end of this first examination, with what we can see from a distance, the market closing early, the stones shifting in the wall, the grooves in the throne room floor that the stone recorded because it was asked to bear the same weight across the same paths for decades without complaint. The monks below, still thinking their long thoughts, undisturbed by any of it. The pit under the moons, unmarked. The Sarlacc patient, as it has always been patient. The sand doing what the sand does. And the question, quiet under all of it, that we have not yet asked out loud: who was there at the end? What did they see? And why, in 15 years of accounts and records and reconstructions, has nobody who was present ever described the center of it clearly? That question belongs to the next fragment we need to examine. And that fragment begins, as so many things in this story begin, with a Twi'lek who was very careful about what he chose to remember. Bib Fortuna gave 3 interviews in the years after Jabba's death. The first was informal, a conversation with a Rodian information broker named Greta Tanu, who was assembling a record of the collapse of the Desaligic operation for a client whose identity she never disclosed. This conversation happened approximately 8 months after the battle at Carkoon, in a cantina in Mos Eisley that no longer exists. Tanu made notes. The notes survive in partial form, having passed through 4 sets of hands before arriving in a private archive on Rhodia. They are written in a compressed shorthand that requires interpretation, and at least 2 passages are illegible due to liquid damage. The second interview was conducted by a New Republic administrative officer named Daryl Koss. She tasked with documenting the criminal infrastructure of the Outer Rim for the Bureau of Reorganization. This interview was formal, recorded on standard data cards, filed, and then, interestingly, classified at a level that restricted access for 11 years. The classification was never explained in the accompanying documentation. The interview was partially declassified 4 years ago, in 15 ABY. Several passages remain sealed. The third interview was not an interview in any formal sense. It was a series of conversations that Fortuna had with a Twi'lek elder from Ryloth named Masabe, a distant relative, by some accounts a childhood acquaintance. By other accounts, someone Fortuna had never met before the first conversation. These exchanges happened over approximately 2 years, between 6 and 8 ABY, and were not recorded. What we have of them is Masabe's reconstruction, written down years later from memory, acknowledged by Bay herself as incomplete. 3 accounts, 3 different contexts, 3 different versions of what Bib Fortuna chose to say about what he saw. What they share is more revealing than what they differ on. Fortuna described Jabba's mood in the final weeks as settled. This word appears, in some form, in all 3 accounts, which is unusual because almost nothing else does. The Rodian broker's notes render it as a Huttese cognate that translates most closely as arrived, in the sense of a journey completed. The New Republic officer's record uses the standard basic word calm, which Fortuna apparently offered as a translation of whatever he said first in Huttese. Masabe's reconstruction uses still, and adds that Fortuna said this with an expression she could not fully interpret, something between admiration and unease. Settled, arrived, calm, still. These are not the words typically used to describe someone in the final weeks before a violent death. They are not the words of someone in crisis or in denial or conducting frantic last negotiations. They suggest something else. And the narrator wants to be careful here, because we are working with filtered accounts of a filtered memory of a person who is now also dead, which means we are at least 3 removes from whatever was actually true, but across 3 separate tellings, from 3 separate contexts, the word stays. Fortuna said that in those final weeks, Jabba worked less, not because the work had stopped. There were still shipments, still negotiations, still the 100 daily frictions of running a large criminal organization. But Jabba himself was less present in the administrative details. He had always delegated, but in the final weeks, he delegated more completely than Fortuna had ever seen him do. He seemed, Fortuna told Masabe to be between things, as if he had finished one consideration and had not yet begun the next. What the next consideration was, Fortuna either did not know or did not say. The arrival of the one who called himself Ben Kenobi is where Fortuna's accounts begin their first significant divergence. In the Rhodian broker's notes, Fortuna describes the arrival of a young human male who presented himself as a bounty hunter, bringing the Wookiee Chewbacca as a captive. And Fortuna notes, with some apparent pride, that he negotiated the bounty personally and that the rate he secured was favorable. He describes the subsequent events: the release of the carbonite slab containing Han Solo, the discovery that Solo was accompanied by the human woman Leia Organa in disguise, the confrontation in the throne room, in the compressed language of someone who has told the story before and is moving through it efficiently. In the New Republic officer's record, the same events are described in more detail. But the detail has a specific quality. It is the detail of someone who has thought carefully about what they want the record to say. The phrasing is more formal. The moments where Fortuna himself made decisions are described in the passive voice, as if things simply happened rather than being chosen. He does not describe what he said when Leia Organa was revealed. He does not describe what he did in the minutes after the confrontation. He describes outcomes, not actions. In Masabe's reconstruction, there is a long pause, apparently, that Fortuna made before discussing this period at all. She writes that he seemed to be choosing something, and that when he began speaking, he began from a different point than she had expected, describing not the arrival of the bounty hunter but a specific morning 3 days before, when he had walked past the carbonite slab containing Solo and had stopped and looked at it for reasons he could not explain. He did not explain them to Masabe either. Here is what we can say with reasonable confidence about Bib Fortuna's position during the events of those final days. He was in the palace when Chewbacca was brought in. He was present in the throne room when Leia Organa was revealed and enslaved. He was in the palace, somewhere, the accounts disagree on where exactly, when Luke Skywalker arrived the following day and demanded an audience. He was somewhere in the palace on the day the sail barge departed for Carkoon. He was not on the sail barge. This is the detail that all three accounts agree on and that none of them explain. Fortuna, who had attended Jabba's public events for decades, who was the major domo and therefore present at every significant function, who had been on the katana dozens of times, was not on the katana that day. The Rhodian broker's notes do not address this at all. The omission is total. The sail barge departs in the notes, and then the next entry describes Fortuna in Mos Espa. The gap between these two entries is not acknowledged. The New Republic officer's record contains a question about this, posed by Officer Koss. Why were you not on the barge? Fortuna's answer, as recorded, is, I had administrative matters to attend to in the palace. Officer Koss apparently did not follow up on this answer, because the record moves immediately to the next question. This is, the narrator suggests, either a failure of the interview process or a decision made for reasons not documented. Masabe's reconstruction says that when she asked this same question, Fortuna was quiet for a long time, and then he said something that she records as follows. He did not ask me to come, and then he changed the subject. The detail that does not appear in the Rhodian broker's notes, she appears in redacted form in the New Republic officer's record and is described most fully in Masabe's reconstruction. The detail that no other account of those final days contains is this. In the last week before the sail barge departed for Carkoon, Jabba spent several hours each evening reading from the Desiligic clan records. These were old documents, physical documents in some cases, rolled and sealed in the archival containers that Hutt clans use for records of particular significance. Masabe writes that Fortuna described them as the old ones, the histories of the Desiligic Khajidic that predated Jabba's own rise, going back several generations, the accounts of ancestors, the records of decisions made before Jabba was born. Fortuna brought them from storage at Jabba's request. He did not know why Jabba wanted them. He did not ask. This is characteristic of Fortuna. He did not ask questions that might produce answers he did not want to manage. But for once, the incuriosity may have also been genuine. Fortuna, who had been present in Jabba's organization for decades, had learned to recognize when Jabba was working on something, and when Jabba was doing something else entirely. This, he told Masabe, felt like something else entirely. Like a man checking, at the end of a long journey, whether he had taken the right road at the beginning. Fortuna carried the documents in each evening. He carried them out again in the morning. He did not read them himself. He did not look at which sections Jabba had opened. He placed them at the side of the dais and left. Whether Jabba found what he was looking for, Fortuna did not know. Whether he was looking for anything or simply reading, Fortuna did not know that either. And here is where the narrator must stop and be honest. We have 3 accounts, all filtered, all incomplete, all shaped by the needs and fears of the man who gave them. We have a detail about old clan records that appears in only one of the 3 accounts and cannot be corroborated. We have a man who was not on a barge and would not fully explain why. We have a mood, settled, arrived, still, that does not fit neatly into any of the available frameworks for understanding what those final weeks were. And underneath all of it, a question that Fortuna was asked, in some form, by all 3 interlocutors, and that he answered differently each time, without ever, in any version, answering it completely. The question was something like, what did he want? In the end, after all of it, what was he actually trying to build? The Rhodian broker's notes record Fortuna's response as, everything. The New Republic officer's record, in the portion that was declassified, shows Fortuna saying what he had, and then, apparently, nothing further. Masabe writes that Fortuna was quiet for a long time after this question, long enough that she began to think he would not answer at all. And then he said, and she writes this with a note that she cannot be certain of the precise words, only the sense of them, that he had worked for Jabba for decades, and he still was not sure whether Jabba was the most deliberately designed person he had ever known, or whether he had simply been very large and very patient. And the design was something that happened around him while he was doing other things. And then Fortuna said, I don't think he knew either. And then he said, or maybe he did, and I simply wasn't able to see it. Masabe writes that she did not know which of these possibilities Fortuna believed. She writes that she is not sure Fortuna knew. The narrator does not know either. This is the question we will carry through everything that follows, and it will not be answered, because the only person who could answer it is gone, and the records he left behind are tactical rather than interior. The records of what he decided, and not of what he understood himself to be doing. Did he know what he was building? Or did he only know that he was building? This is not a mystery that more information will resolve. It is a gap in the record that is the shape of a person, and the person is permanently absent. We will return to this question in the last chapter. We will not answer it there either. One more detail from Fortuna's accounts, and then the next fragment, Masabe asked, near the end of their last conversation, whether Fortuna ever entered the lower levels of the palace. The Bomar passages, the deep tunnels below the sections that Jabba had occupied. Fortuna said, "I did, a few times, early on." Masabe asked why he stopped. Fortuna said, "The same reason he never went down there." She asked what reason that was. Fortuna did not answer directly. What he said, in Masabe's reconstruction, was that there was something about those passages that made you feel you were being considered. Not watched, considered. As if whatever was down there was not interested in you as a threat or as prey, but was simply thinking about you, including you in some larger calculation that you would never be shown. And he said he didn't like it. He said once that a place that thinks about you without asking your permission is not a place you want to be. Masabe writes that she asked whether Jabba had said this about the monks specifically. Fortuna said he wasn't sure the monks and the place were separable. This is the last thing Fortuna said that is relevant to what we are examining. He died 4 years after this conversation, under circumstances that are a separate story for a different time. The palace is the next fragment, the passage downward, what was built on top of what and what stayed in the stone when everything else was taken away. It was a monastery. The stone was here before anything else. This is where it begins, not with Jabba, not with the monks, but with Tatooine sandstone laid down in horizontal layers over millions of years, each stratum a record of a different climate, a different pressure, a different arrangement of whatever forces shaped this world before anyone arrived to build on it. The cliff formation on the edge of the Dune Sea is not a dramatic geological feature. It does not rise to impressive heights. It is a low, dense mass of layered rock, orange and brown, and, in certain lights, a deep red that suggests heat from within, even when the stone itself is cool to the touch. It sits at the edge of the desert as if placed there deliberately, though nothing placed it. It simply accumulated, slowly, over time, the way most significant things do. The Bomar arrived approximately 700 years before the events we are examining. We do not know their exact origin. The order is ancient, older than their presence on Tatooine, and their records, what exists of them, are written in an internal notation system that has been only partially translated by the handful of scholars who have attempted it. What we know of the Bomar, we know primarily from external accounts, from travelers who encountered them, from traders who noted their existence in passing references. They were described consistently as people who did not want to be found, not in hiding exactly. They did not conceal their presence, but they chose their locations for their distance from everything else, and Tatooine, in 700 BBY, was as far from everything else as the Outer Rim offered. Their philosophy, as best it can be reconstructed, held that the physical world was not an obstacle to understanding, but a distraction from it. Not evil, simply irrelevant to the work they wanted to do. The body generates sensation continuously: temperature, hunger, discomfort, the pressure of one surface against another, the specific weight of gravity. All of this sensation is data, and the mind, occupied with processing it, has less capacity for the deeper consideration the Bomar believed was possible if the data could be sufficiently reduced. The ultimate practice of their order was the removal of the brain from the body. Surgery conducted by other monks, precise and deliberate. The brain preserved in a nutrient solution in a sealed jar. She was then carried by a spider-droid body, 6-legged, mechanical, approximately the height of a human knee, through whatever space the monk wished to occupy. The body was gone. The sensation was gone. What remained was thought, uninterrupted. The monks who built this monastery on Tatooine were, many of them, still living in this form when Jabba arrived. They built simply. The external structure that visitors would have encountered in 700 BBY was modest. A carved entrance into the cliff face, reinforced with cut stone, a series of corridors descending into the rock at a slight angle. The monks did not build upward initially because they had no reason to. The corridors went inward and downward, following the natural passages that already existed in the rock formation and widening them where necessary. The walls were smooth, cut with tools, not blasted, because the B'omar did not work with explosives even when they were available. They preferred the slower method because the slower method produced walls with a different quality, a surface that showed the marks of considered work rather than force. The corridors were narrow. They were built for monks who had, in many cases, reduced themselves to jars on 6 mechanical legs. A human adult can move through the main passages of the B'omar section of the palace, but only just and not comfortably. This was not an oversight. The monks built to their own requirements, and their requirements were not the requirements of the larger bodies they had left behind. At intervals along the main corridors, there are alcoves carved into the stone, roughly circular, roughly the diameter of a seated human, going back perhaps 2 feet into the wall. These are meditation recesses. A brain in jar could rest in one and be, in a sense, alone, in a place designed to hold exactly one mind. The records of the initial seizure are sparse on the B'omar side and entirely absent on Jabba's side. Hutt administrative records from that era are not the kind of thing that was preserved with historical purposes in mind. What we have is a reference in a merchant's log from Mos Eisley, dated to the same general period, noting that the monk fortress in the deep desert had been taken by Hutt interests, and that travellers in that area should expect new toll arrangements on the surrounding routes. This is the earliest external reference to Jabba's occupation of the structure. The monks did not resist because resistance was not a B'omar concept in the operational sense. They were not pacifists in any philosophically committed way. They simply had no framework for the kind of resistance that the situation seemed to call for. They had no weapons. They had no political connections. They had no allies to call on. What they had was their tunnels, their alcoves, their work. So they retreated to the lower passages and continued. The construction that began above them would, over the following centuries, transform the external appearance of the monastery entirely. Jabba's organization built upward and outward, towers added to the cliff face, walls extending to either side, a hangar built into the rock on the eastern face for the landing and storage of small craft, a throne room carved from the largest interior chamber, which had been the monks' primary meditation hall, the high-ceilinged space where the B'omar had once gathered their jars in contemplative proximity. The rancor pit was dug directly below the throne room floor, an excavation that went deeper than any of the original B'omar passages, and that the monks, in their records from this period, note simply as the digging below, without commentary on what it was for. The monks knew what was above them. They chose not to engage with that knowledge beyond noting it. The middle levels are the most complex part of the building now. They are the zone where the 2 architectures meet and have not resolved their differences. B'omar stonework below, narrow passages, smooth walls, the carved alcoves, and Jabba's construction above, which is broader, higher ceilinged, built for species of varying sizes and for the movement of crowds. The transition between the 2 architectural styles happens gradually, across several floors, and produces, in the middle sections, a quality of space that is genuinely strange. A corridor will begin with Bomar dimensions and expand by increments to Hutt era proportions. Door frames are doubled, a narrower inner frame from the original construction and a wider outer frame added later, so that the door itself is thick with history. These middle levels also carry the clearest physical evidence of Jabba's occupation. The floors have been replaced in some areas with different stone, a slightly darker variety, quarried from somewhere other than the local formation, laid in large flat slabs designed to support heavy continuous traffic. The original Bomar floors, where they remain, show the marks of a lighter occupation. The small circular impressions left by spider droid legs, thousands of them overlapping across centuries. The replacement floors show something different. The long, broad grooves worn by something very large, moving across the same paths again and again. Different patterns. The Bomar moved everywhere, in all directions, following the paths of thought rather than the paths of routine. The grooves in the replacement floors trace specific lines, from the entrance of the throne room to the dais, from the dais to the side corridor where food was brought, from the side corridor back to the dais. The same paths, the same weight, across decades. The walls of the middle levels still carry markings from both occupations. The Bomar carved their notation system at eye level, at a height corresponding to where a jar on a spider droid would be, which is approximately knee height for a standing human. Small, precise characters, neatly spaced. Above these, at human height and above, are the additions of Jabba's era. Hooks and attachment points for torches, for decorations, for restraints. The stains left by decades of smoke from the mounted braziers that lined the main corridor. A section of wall near the throne room entrance that is covered with Huttese script that the Wike who occupy the upper levels cannot read and have not attempted to translate. The throne room itself. The Bomar called it the Chamber of Primary Consideration, or at least this is the translation offered by the one scholar who has spent significant time with their notation system. The chamber where the largest gathering of minds could occur simultaneously. The room was not originally designed for anything that required one figure at the center and all others facing it. Bomar gatherings were circular, the jars arranged so that each mind was equidistant from each other mind. There was no hierarchy implied in the spatial arrangement. Jabba's renovation of the room imposed hierarchy immediately and completely. The dais at the center rear, the raised position, the arrangement of every other element in the room, the hookah resting on its side table, the musician's alcove, the chain attachment points in the ceiling, all of it oriented toward that single point. You could not enter the room without understanding immediately and physically where the room's center of gravity was. The architecture did the work before anyone said a word. This was deliberate. The throne room was a tool, and like all of Jabba's tools, it was precisely calibrated to its purpose. The first mention of the pipe is in a Bomar notation from what scholars estimate to be approximately 3 centuries after Jabba's initial occupation, placing it roughly in the Clone Wars era, when Jabba's power was at its most extensive and the palace's activity was at its most concentrated. The notation is brief. The monks did not write at length about what happened above them. It was, from their perspective, background noise. But this particular entry is specific. A monk identified only by a glyph that the scholar translates as something close to the one who considers water recorded, in the clinical language of Bomar observation, a sensory impression that penetrated the lower passages with unusual frequency, a warm, dense smell of something burning in a slow, controlled way, accompanied by a faint light that the monk describes as orange, like a thing that believes itself to be the sun. The monk does not explain what the light is. The monk does not know what the light is. The monk simply records it, as they would record any persistent sensory impression that reached them from above, noting it as data without interpretation. The orange light burned every night in what had been the chamber of primary consideration. The smell of it settled into the stone the way smells do over decades, not on the surface, but into the grain of it, into the small open spaces in the sandstone structure. The Wike, who aired the throne room in the first weeks of their occupation, could not remove it. They added their own smells on top of it. The amber smell remains underneath. The monks below continue undisturbed. This point deserves its own moment of attention because it is genuinely strange. Two occupations of the upper levels, Jabba's centuries-long presence, and now the Wike's temporary installation, and throughout both, the Bomar have maintained their uninterrupted contemplative practice in the passages below. Brains in jars, carried by spider droids on 6 mechanical legs, moving through corridors lit only by the bioluminescent moss that grows on the Bomar stonework in certain sections. Their notation system continues. Their alcoves receive their practitioners. Their work proceeds. The question of what they think about is not answerable. We do not have the translation capacity to read their internal philosophical records, which are distinct from their observational notes. What they consider, what constitutes the content of pure Bomar thought. When the body is gone, and the sensation is gone, and the mind is freed for its primary work, is not available to us. But they are there. When the Wike, who went down 2 levels, came back up quickly, and would not describe what he had seen. What he encountered was almost certainly a spider droid moving through the passage, carrying its jar through whatever ambient light existed, going about business that was not his and not intended for him. The Bomar do not threaten, they simply continue. And in that continuation, they carry something forward that the upper levels have lost and regained and lost again. The sense of a place that was built for a specific purpose and has never abandoned that purpose, no matter what accumulated above it. The original intention of the structure persists below, patient as sandstone, while the upper levels change occupation every generation. The monks were here before Jabba. They are here after him. They will be here after the Wike. What Jabba chose not to visit says something. Fortuna's account, specifically the detail offered to Masabe, that Jabba refused to descend to the lower levels if he could avoid it, is interesting in this context. The reason Fortuna offered was oblique, a place that thinks about you without asking permission. Whatever Jabba meant by this, it suggests that he was aware of what was below him, that he understood the monastery as a living thing that had simply retreated downward, and that this awareness was, in some way, uncomfortable to him. A man who made his living by thinking about other people, came by measuring them, by identifying their fears and their dependencies and their limits with precision, uncomfortable in the presence of something that was, perhaps, applying the same consideration to him. Something old enough and patient enough and sufficiently detached from ordinary concerns to see him clearly, without the social machinery that usually filtered how he was seen. The monks asked nothing of him. They expected nothing. They needed nothing he could provide or withhold. And perhaps this, more than any theological discomfort, was what made the lower levels a place he avoided. He was used to being the most patient entity in any room. Below the throne room floor, in the passages, his weight never grooved. Something older and quieter had been patient for 7 centuries before he arrived. His enemies would come to that throne room. They would stand in the space he had designed to make them feel small and observable and owned. They would look at the dais and feel what the room was built to make them feel. We will examine, in the next fragment, what those encounters produced, what the enemies saw, and what in seeing they understood. The people who understood Jabba best were not the people who worked for him. This is not unusual. The people who work closely around a significant figure tend to understand the surface of that figure very well, the habits, the preferences, the specific texture of their moods, and the interior not at all. Proximity is not the same as clarity. Sometimes proximity is the thing that prevents clarity, because when you are close enough to something, you can only see the part of it that faces you. The people who understood Jabba best were the people who spent years trying to dismantle him and failed. There is a specific quality of understanding that comes from sustained opposition. You cannot work against something for years without learning its shape. You learn it the way a river learns the shape of a rock, not by being told, not by studying it from a distance, but by moving against it continuously and feeling in every point of contact exactly where it does not give. We have 3 such accounts. They do not agree on everything. They are not meant to. The first account comes from a Bith named Vos Feldrick. Feldrick was an information broker, not the kind that operates openly, with a shop and a sign and a publicly known rate schedule, but the kind that maintains a carefully constructed invisibility and charges accordingly for it. He worked the spice route intelligence networks for approximately 20 years, and for 15 of those years, a portion of his work was directed against Jabba's operation. Not because of ideology, Feldrick has never been described, in any account, as someone with strong political commitments. He worked against Jabba's spice networks because a consortium of smaller smuggling operations was paying him to do so, and the work was interesting, and the pay was adequate. For 15 years, Feldrick was good at it. He disrupted supply chains by intercepting courier communications and substituting false route information. He identified 3 of Jabba's informants within the Kessel operations and quietly fed them contradictory intelligence until their reports became unreliable and they were removed. He brokered the redirection of a significant spice shipment in 15 BBY, a transaction that cost Jabba's organization an estimated 30,000 credits, and that Feldrick was quietly proud of for years afterward. In 12 BBY, Feldrick was caught. He was not caught dramatically. He did not make a fatal error that someone clever identified. He was caught because Jabba had known about him for, by his later estimation, at least 2 years before the catch, had known, had watched, had allowed Feldrick to continue operating, and had used the time to trace every thread of Feldrick's network backward to its source. By the time Feldrick was brought to the palace, Jabba had a complete map of the consortium that had been paying him, the secondary brokers Feldrick used as intermediaries, and the 3 other Bith information specialists Feldrick had trained in his methods. Feldrick was not killed. He spent 3 days in the palace, a detail he describes, in the account he gave years later to a journalist on Nar Shaddaa, as the most frightening experience of his life, signed not because of what happened to him, but because of what he was shown. On the 3rd day, he was brought before Jabba and given a detailed account, delivered through an interpreter, in the calm and somewhat formal huttes of official communication, rather than the casual hooties of daily business, of everything Jabba's organization knew about him, his methods, his clients, his home on Brental 4, the school his children attended on Brental 4. The children were not threatened. The school was not threatened. they were mentioned. Their existence was placed in the room between Feldrick and the entity on the dais and left there. And then Feldrick was told that he was free to go. The warning, as Feldrick reconstructed it afterward, was not, "Stop working against us, or the children will be harmed." The warning was, "We know everything about you, and we are choosing to let you leave. And you will spend the rest of your life aware that this choice can be revisited at any time and for any reason." The specificity was the point. The patience was the point. 2 years of watching, of letting him work, of mapping him thoroughly before acting. The message was not about power in the crude sense. It was about a particular kind of power that is more difficult to resist than force. The demonstration that someone has been thinking about you, carefully, for longer than you knew. Feldrick left Tatooine. He retired from intelligence work. He moved his family from Brental 4 to a different world, which, he acknowledged in the interview, he understood immediately was a futile gesture. If Jabba's organization wanted to find him, they would find him regardless of what planet he was on. He never worked against Jabba's operation again. In the interview, conducted 6 years after Jabba's death, the journalist asked Feldrick what he thought when he heard the news from Carcoon. Feldrick was quiet for a moment. Then he said that his first response was not relief. He said his first response was something closer to disorientation, the feeling of a tension he had been holding for 12 years, suddenly having nothing to push against. He said it took him several days before he felt anything else. He did not describe what he felt after several days. He did not need to. The second account comes from a Bothan named Rel Timmis. Timmis ran intelligence networks, not for profit primarily, though the work paid adequately, but as a form of principled opposition to the criminal infrastructure of the Outer Rim. He is described, in the records of the various organizations he worked with over the years, as someone who believed genuinely in a more ordered galaxy and who had chosen network disruption as his specific contribution to that project. This made him, in the narrator's estimation, a more complicated adversary for Jabba than Feldrick, because Feldrick was working for money and could theoretically be bought or redirected, while Timmis was working for something he believed in and had less flexibility. Timmis built a network on Tatooine and in the surrounding systems between approximately 18 and 16 BBY. It was a good network. The Bothans are, by a long cultural tradition, skilled at this kind of construction, and Timmis was skilled even by Bothan standards. 14 operatives across 6 systems, communicating through a layered relay system that used 3 levels of encoding and rotated its contact protocols on a schedule that Timmis changed personally every 30 days. Jabba did not dismantle this network through violence. This is the detail that distinguishes the Timmis case from what most people would expect. And it is the detail that Timmis himself, in a memoir fragment he wrote late in his life, unpublished, found in his personal effects after his death, and shared with a historian who has written about Outer Rim intelligence operations, could not reconcile with his existing understanding of how criminal organizations worked. The network was not infiltrated. No operative was turned. No communication was intercepted in the conventional sense. What happened, instead, was that the information the network was passing became, gradually and without any single identifiable point of intervention, slightly wrong. Not obviously wrong. Not wrong in ways that would trigger an immediate alert. Wrong in the way that a map is wrong when it is 6 months old and one road has been rerouted and one landmark has been removed. Accurate enough to use, inaccurate enough to mislead at precisely the moments when accuracy is most critical. The network continued to function. The operatives continued to report. The relay system continued to rotate, and the picture it assembled of Jabba's operations became, over approximately 14 months, a reliable map of where Jabba's operations were not. Timis writes that he still does not know definitively how this was done. His best reconstruction, assembled over years of reviewing every piece of information his network produced during that period, is that Jabba's organization identified 3 nodes in his relay system that were particularly trusted and introduced small, targeted distortions at each node simultaneously. The distortions were calibrated to interact with each other across the relay chain. Each individual distortion was small enough to seem like ordinary error, but the combined effect at the receiving end was a systematic bias in a specific direction. This required, Timis writes, someone who understood his network's architecture well enough to model how distortions would propagate through it. Someone who had mapped the relay system's logic before introducing any interference. Someone who had, in other words, understood what he was building well enough to build against it from the inside, using its own structure as the mechanism of its failure. Timis shut the network down when he realized what had happened. By that point, the damage was already complete. The 14 operatives were safe. None of them were harmed, which Timis notes with something that reads, in the memoir fragment, as genuine surprise. They were simply useless. The network that had taken him 2 years to construct had become a 2-year investment in providing Jabba's organization with a detailed picture of what a competent opposition network looked like, how it was structured, and what its protocols were. The memoir fragment ends with a sentence that the narrator wants to place carefully in front of the listener. Timis writes, "I spent 2 years building something I thought was against him. I now believe I spent 2 years building something for him." The third account is the most difficult to discuss, because the man who gave it requested before he died that his name not be attached to it. He was an imperial Moff. His territory is partially identifiable from the internal references in his communication, but the name remains sealed in the New Republic archive that holds the document, under a classification that several historians have challenged without success. He had 3 meetings with Jabba during the period of imperial consolidation, roughly 19 to 17 BBY, the years when the newly formed empire was establishing its relationships with the major criminal organizations of the Outer Rim. These relationships were complicated because the Empire needed the Outer Rim's criminal infrastructure to continue functioning smoothly enough to prevent chaos in areas where Imperial governance was not yet fully established, while also officially representing itself as an order that did not tolerate criminal activity. Jabba was the largest and most important of these necessary complications. The Moff's first meeting, by his account, was conducted with what he describes as professional caution. He had been briefed on Jabba's resources and his temperament, and he entered the meeting prepared for a certain kind of negotiation. He writes that the meeting did not go the way he expected, without specifying in what sense. He describes leaving with a satisfactory outcome, certain transit arrangements confirmed, certain mutual non-interference agreements established, but with a sense that the satisfaction was less complete than it appeared. The second meeting, 8 months later, was shorter. The arrangements were adjusted. The Moff writes that Jabba made one observation during this meeting that he could not stop thinking about afterward. He does not record what the observation was. He notes only that it was about the long-term stability of Imperial governance in the Outer Rim, and that it was stated without hostility, almost without obvious intent, the kind of remark that seems, in the moment, like a casual aside, and reveals itself afterward as having been aimed at something specific. The third meeting was the last. Afterward, The Moff sent a private communication to a colleague, another Moff, in an adjacent territory that survives in partial form in a document cache recovered after the Battle of Endor. The communication is short. The relevant section reads as follows: "He is the only figure in this territory I would describe as genuinely dangerous, not because of his resources, which are significant, and not because of his enforcers, which are adequate, because of his patience. He can afford to wait. Waiting is his primary instrument. An opponent who is willing to wait longer than you are does not need any other advantage." The communication was written approximately 16 years before Jabba's death. The narrator wants the listener to hold this alongside what Fortuna told Masabe, the image of Jabba in the last week of his life. In the evenings, reading old clan records on a barge at anchor above a desert, waiting for something, or reviewing something, or simply being still the way a man is still when he has decided that all the decisions worth making have been made. Patient, still, arrived. The Moff's assessment, written 16 years before the end, may have been the most accurate account of Jabba that anyone outside his organization ever produced. The Moff did not know this. He was not congratulated for his analysis. His territory was later absorbed into a different administrative region, and his political influence diminished. He died, the records show, approximately 6 years after writing that communication, of causes unrelated to Jabba or to anything in this story. He was right. He simply had no way to know what he was right about. These three accounts, the Bith who was released, the Bothan whose network built the wrong thing, the Moff who measured the patience and could not counteract it, share a specific quality that is worth naming before we move on. None of them describe the version of Jabba that the myth would eventually establish. The myth's Jabba acts on appetite. He wants, he takes, he punishes the people who obstruct the wanting and the taking. He is, in the myth's structure, fundamentally impulsive. A creature of immediate desire who builds an empire not through design, but through the accumulated weight of uncontested appetite. The myth needs this version because it makes the defeat at Carcoon comprehensible. A creature of pure appetite, undone finally by his own craving for spectacle, his own refusal to simply execute the people brought before him rather than display them. Feldrick's Jabba waited 2 years to act on information he had already gathered. Timmis's Jabba mapped an opposing network's architecture and used it against itself without ever triggering the alarm that a direct attack would have triggered. The Moff's Jabba made a remark in a meeting that the Moff was still turning over weeks later, still trying to understand what had been aimed at and whether it had landed. These are portraits of a different entity than the myth describes. The narrator is not going to draw a conclusion from this. The evidence does not warrant a clean conclusion, and clean conclusions are not the business of this reconstruction. What the evidence warrants is a question held carefully and not answered. What are we missing about how Jabba died? If everything we know about how he operated looks nothing like how the myth says he operated, we will come back to this. The Bothan's account contains one more detail that does not belong to the story of his dismantled network. It belongs to a later period, approximately 2 to 1 BBY. The years when the Rebel Alliance was beginning to develop its organizational coherence and its intelligence on Jabba's operation was becoming more systematic. Timus, by this point, had moved on from Tatooine. He was working different networks in different territories, but he maintained contacts, and through those contacts, he learned something he recorded in his memoir fragment without explanation and without apparent resolution. Jabba, during this period, had access to information about Rebel Alliance movements. This was not unusual. Jabba's intelligence networks were extensive, and the rebellion operated in territories where his people were present. What was unusual was what Jabba did with this information. He did not sell it to the Empire, which was actively purchasing rebel intelligence and would have paid well for what Jabba had. He did not use it against the Alliance directly, did not leverage it to extract payments or use it to strengthen his own position by demonstrating to the Empire that he was a useful partner in ways they had not yet recognized. He held it. Timmis writes that he spent considerable time trying to understand why. His conclusion, and he acknowledges it is speculative, is that Jabba was holding the information as what he calls a strategic reserve, keeping it until a moment when it would be worth more than what the immediate sale would yield, waiting for the right application. But the moment never came. The rebellion grew faster than Jabba's calculation had accounted for. The information aged past its usefulness. The Alliance's positions, movements, and personnel that Jabba had mapped became outdated as the organization expanded and changed. The reserve was never spent. Timmis writes, "I do not know what he intended to do with it. I am not sure he knew." The narrator pauses here. There is a thread beginning to be visible, faint, crossing multiple accounts, appearing in different forms in different testimonies. Jabba, making decisions that do not straightforwardly serve the immediate interest. Jabba, holding things in reserve. Jabba, impatient in contexts where patience is not obviously the tactical choice. The information about the rebellion that he never sold. The minor refusal that he let pass without punishment, in a year of other distractions, in a way that sent one person down a different path than they might otherwise have taken. The threads do not yet form a shape. The narrator wants to be honest about this, but threads that appear across enough independent accounts begin to suggest something. Not a design, necessarily, but a consistency. A way of moving through the world that is more deliberate than the myth allows, operating at a level below the one most observers were watching. What that level contained and what it was aimed at, this is the next thing we need to look at. And we need to begin not with Jabba, but with a moisture farmer on the edge of a desert in a year when everything was shifting, who was offered a job he did not take. There is a document in the partial archive of Jabba's administrative records, recovered from the palace in the months after his death, catalogued by a New Republic bureau officer who did not know what she was looking at, and filed in a general collection of Hutt commercial documents that has been only partially reviewed in the 15 years since. That records, in the compressed notation of Desiligic business correspondence, an offer made and declined in the Anchorhead district of Tatooine in 32 BBY. The document is not dramatic. It is one of several hundred similar records from that period. The routine administrative traffic of a large organization conducting ordinary business across a large territory. An agent in the Anchorhead district noted a candidate for a supply chain liaison position. The candidate was evaluated. An offer was extended. The candidate declined. The agent noted the declination and closed the file with a notation that translates approximately as "no further action required. Matter resolved by circumstance." The name of the candidate is recorded in the Hutt phonetic rendering of a human name. The rendering is imprecise. Hutt phonetic transcription of basic names frequently is. But the most probable reconstruction gives us something that sounds like Lars. Owen Lars. No further action required. Matter resolved by circumstance. We need to place this document in its context, because context is what makes a document mean something rather than nothing. In 32 BBY, the Trade Federation's blockade of Naboo was reshaping the commercial geography of the Outer Rim in ways that the major criminal organizations were scrambling to anticipate. Jabba's spice operations ran through a series of relay points between the Kessel sector and the Mid-Rim, and the blockade threatened two of those relay points by destabilizing the traffic patterns that made them viable. Jabba's organization was, during this specific period, occupied primarily with recalibrating routes, a complex and time-sensitive logistics problem that required significant administrative attention across multiple systems simultaneously. The Anchorhead supply chain position was a minor matter, one of dozens of personnel decisions happening that month. The agent who handled it had authority to close it without escalating, and did. Jabba would not have been told about it. It was below the level of detail that reached him. This is important. What we are examining is not a decision Jabba made with full attention and deliberate intent. It is the absence of a decision, the administrative indifference of an organization too occupied with larger concerns to pursue one minor refusal, in one minor district on one minor planet at the edge of its territory. The thing that happened in Anchorhead in 32 BBY was essentially nothing, a non-event, a small door that failed to open and then closed and was forgotten before it finished closing. This is the kind of moment that history is almost entirely made of. The large gestures, the battles, the treaties, the speeches, the decisions that people know they are making. These are the visible architecture of events. But the actual load-bearing structure is almost always invisible, composed of small moments that nobody recorded because nobody knew they were significant, that nobody examined because they seemed to require no examination, that accumulated into outcomes that, seen from a sufficient distance, looked like they were inevitable. Owen Lars went home to his moisture farm. The administrative record closed, and in the space created by that closing, everything else was free to happen. Shmi Skywalker is in the public record in several places, and the narrator wants to be careful about how we approach her, because she is one of those figures whose historical existence has been almost entirely subsumed by her relationship to someone else. What is preserved of her, the records, the accounts, are almost all accounts of her in relation to others. Her son, her later husband, the order that took her son. But there are fragments of her that exist independently of those relationships, and this is where the narrator wants to dwell for a moment, because she matters to this story not as context for someone else, but as a person who made choices and experienced consequences that were entirely her own. Shmi Skywalker was enslaved. The record of her ownership passes through several hands before arriving, in approximately 32 BBY, with a junk dealer named Watto in the Mos Espa market district, the same market district that is quieter now and closes early, whose routes were once stable and are now contested. Watto's records, which were seized and catalogued after his business's eventual decline, list Shmi and her son, Anakin, as property with assessed values in the commercial notation of Tatooine's slave economy. This notation is clinical, and it is worth acknowledging that the clinical quality of the historical record is itself a form of violence. The reduction of persons to assessed values in a commercial register is not a neutral act of documentation, and reading it requires holding simultaneously the content of what it says and the dehumanizing framework it uses to say it. Shmi is listed. Her son is listed. Their values are recorded. In approximately 32 BBY, the same year the administrative record in Anchorhead was closed with no further action required, Anakin Skywalker was 9 years old, and Shmi was in her mid-30s, and they were both in Watto's inventory. And the galaxy was arranged around them in a configuration that seemed, from the inside, simply like the configuration of the galaxy. Fixed, given. The way things were was about to change. though neither of them could have known it, and the change would not feel from the inside like the beginning of anything. It would feel like what it was, the disruption of ordinary life by large forces that did not consult the people they were disrupting. Anakin Skywalker left Tatooine in 32 BBY. The circumstances of his departure are part of a larger story that this reconstruction is not primarily concerned with. The specific events that brought a Jedi Master to Tatooine, the pod race, the negotiations over Anakin's freedom, the moment his mother chose to let him go. These events are documented elsewhere and from many perspectives. What this reconstruction is concerned with is a narrower question: what the departure meant to the people it left behind. Shmi was left behind. She had made the choice to let her son go with a freedom that, the record suggests, she exercised as an act of will rather than as a resignation. She believed his going was right, and she believed it in the specific way that parents believe things about their children when they are trying to put the child's future above their own grief. The accounts of people who knew her in the years after describe a woman who did not speak of her son with regret and did not speak of herself with self-pity. She had an arrangement with the world, and she kept it, but she was alone in it. Tatooine's slave community did not have the social infrastructure that would have made her aloneness ordinary or sustainable. Watto's business declined in the years after Anakin's departure. The talent that had made the shop viable was gone, and Watto himself, by several accounts, became increasingly difficult in the way that disappointed people sometimes become difficult. Shmi's situation contracted, and then, in approximately 22 BBY, a moisture farmer named Cliegg Lars purchased her freedom. The record of this transaction is in the Lars homestead documents, a set of papers that survived because they were preserved with the homestead's official land registry, which the New Republic surveyed as part of its Outer Rim territorial documentation program. The transaction is recorded simply: a sale completed, a price paid, via a status changed from one category to another in the Tatooine slave registry. Beneath the administrative notation, in handwriting that the document archivist identified as added later, after the official record was made, someone wrote, in basic rather than in the commercial notation, "She is free now." The handwriting has been attributed, tentatively, to Cliegg Lars. Owen Lars was Cliegg's son from a previous relationship. He was present when his father brought Shmi to the homestead. He was there when they married. He was there for the years that followed, the years when the homestead was, by the accounts of a few traders who visited the area, something that functioned as a family, with the specific texture that families have when they are built deliberately rather than simply inherited. The Moisture Farmers Cooperative Register for the Anchorhead district lists Owen Lars as a contributing member beginning approximately 21 BBY. His name appears in the attendance records of cooperative meetings, in the lists of members who participated in shared equipment arrangements, in a letter of dispute about water right boundaries that was apparently resolved without significant conflict. He is described, in the brief characterizations these records sometimes carry, as reliable, present, someone who did his share. He was, by all available evidence, a man who wanted a small life and was willing to work for it. The narrator wants to stay with this for a moment, because it is easy to move past people who want small lives when you are looking at history from a distance. History tends to focus on the people who wanted large things, who wanted to change the galaxy or rule it, or burn it down or save it. Owen Lars wanted a moisture farm on the edge of the Junland wastes. He wanted his cooperative dues paid on time. He wanted the vaporator lines maintained. He wanted what was his to remain his. These are not small wants when you consider what they cost him. Anakin Skywalker returned to Tatooine in 22 BBY. He came because his mother was in danger, because something had reached him through the Force, across the years and the distance, a signal that he had tried not to hear and finally could not ignore. He came, and Owen Lars was there, and they met as strangers who were suddenly, by the specific mathematics of marriage and family, not strangers at all. Brothers, after a fashion. She's the kind that arrive too late to have a history together and have to construct a relationship out of whatever materials the present offers. Owen was there when Anakin left to find his mother. Owen was there when Anakin came back. The account of what Owen knew about what had happened, about what Anakin had done in the Tusken camp, about why he came back without Shmi, is not in any written record. Owen did not leave memoirs. He did not give interviews. What he knew, he kept. The cooperative register shows him attending the next meeting after Shmi's death. His name is there in the attendance list, spelled the same way it always was, in the same handwriting of whoever kept the register. No note, no absence, just present, present. The word sits differently now than it did when we first saw it in the cooperative attendance records. Here is what Owen Lars carried after Anakin left Tatooine for the second time. He carried the homestead, which had been Klieg's and was now his. He carried the vaporator lines, the water registry, the cooperative dues. He carried the maintenance of a life that had been built by someone else, and that he had agreed, in the specific way that people agree to things without being asked directly, to continue. He carried his father's grief over Shmi, which became Owen's grief too. In the particular way, grief is inherited when you live in close proximity to someone who is carrying it. And he carried something else, something that arrived approximately 3 years later, in 19 BBY. When a man who had once been the frightened child of a woman named Shmi Skywalker returned to the desert homestead with a bundle that was not a child, yet in any way that mattered, and asked Owen to keep it safe. The record of this transaction, because it was a transaction of a kind, does not exist in any archive. It exists only in the life that followed it. The 19 years that Owen Lars spent on that homestead, with a child who was not his, in a landscape that offered no concealment except the concealment of ordinariness, maintaining the small life he had always wanted, with the specific discipline of someone who understood that the small life was now the most important thing in the galaxy and could not appear to be. The cooperative records show him for those 19 years as present, reliable, his share done, his dues paid, his name in the attendance lists in the same handwriting. The narrator needs to step back here. We have laid out 4 fragments and we have not connected them explicitly, and we are not going to connect them explicitly because the connection is not ours to make. It belongs to the silence between the fragments. It belongs to the listener who has been paying attention and can feel the shape of what these pieces describe, even without being told the shape's name. What we can say is this: in 32 BBY, an administrative decision was not made. A file was closed. A man went home to his farm. These are the smallest possible units of consequence. The residue of a distraction, the nothing that results from an organization looking the other way at the exact right moment without knowing it was the right moment. What grew from that nothing was a chain of ordinary events: a farm, a marriage, a freedom purchased, a stepbrother gained and half known, a grief inherited, a bundle accepted. 19 years of careful, deliberate, exhausting ordinariness. And at the end of that chain, a young man who grew up not knowing what he was, who became what the galaxy needed him to become, who stood on a barge above the great pit of Carcoon and did what he did. The chain runs from a closed administrative file to that barge, and not one person in the chain, not Owen, not Shmi, not the agent who wrote no further action required, ever knew they were in it. Jabba did not know he was in it either. He was in another room, thinking about spice routes. Owen Lars, on an ordinary evening. The narrator does not know which evening. It does not need to be a specific evening. It needs only to be one of the 10,000 evenings that the record does not preserve. The ordinary dusk moments of a life that was never going to be written about, that asked only to be lived. The twin suns going down over the Jundland wastes, the way they do, not together, but in sequence. The first dipping below the western ridge first, and then, some minutes later, the second following. And the sky in between, going through a spectrum of oranges and reds that Tatooine produces with a consistency that suggests the planet has decided this is the one beauty it is willing to offer. Owen, standing outside the homestead entrance, the vaporators at rest, the cooperative dues paid, the life maintained. He does not know what is moving toward him across that horizon, but he does not know what the horizon has been quietly accumulating over years and decades from decisions made and not made in rooms he has never entered and will never enter. The horizon simply looks like the horizon. He watches it the way a man watches something familiar, without expectation, without anxiety, with the settled attention of someone who has looked at the same view enough times to know exactly what it will do next. The suns go down, the sky goes orange and red, and in the dark that follows, the things that witness without being witnessed continue their work. The stars come out, the desert cools, the silence in the palace somewhere across the dune sea holds its amber smell, and far away on Coruscant, a transaction is being recorded that will not mean anything for years. And in the deep passages of an old monastery, something ancient and patient moves through narrow tunnels, thinking thoughts that have nothing to do with any of this. The next fragment is an object, something that was present at the making of hundreds of oaths, that witnessed everything the throne room witnessed, that is sitting right now in a glass case in a room on Coruscant, warm to the touch in the dark, still doing what it was built to do. We should go and look at it. Before the pipe, the tree, and before the tree, the planet, which is where this fragment has to begin, because the object we are examining carries its origin in its material, and the material's origin is a story of destruction that most people who encounter Elysian amber do not know and would not think to ask about. Elysia is a planet in Hutt space. It exists now and has existed throughout the period we are examining as a working world, a place organized around the extraction of useful things, operated by Hutt interests, inhabited by the workforce that extraction requires. Its history, prior to that organization, is not well documented, because the documentation of what a place was before it became useful is rarely a priority for the people who made it useful. What we know of Elysia's pre-industrial ecology comes from a handful of scientific surveys conducted in the early Republic era, before the Hutt's industrial operations had fully reshaped the planet's surface, and from a small number of naturalist accounts preserved in archives that nobody with commercial interests has found reason to destroy. These sources describe, among other things, a grove of resin trees on Elysia's northern continent that produced a substance unlike any other known botanical resin in that region of space. The trees were large. The survey estimates range between 40 and 60 feet in height, and slow-growing, with a maturation cycle of several centuries before they reached the size at which the resin could be harvested in commercially viable quantities. The resin itself was unusual in two properties. First, it hardened with exceptional density when processed, approaching the structural integrity of certain manufactured composites, resistant to heat and pressure in ways that organic materials rarely achieve. Second, and more remarkably, the hardened resin retained the bioluminescent properties of the living tree. The resin trees used bioluminescence as a biological signaling mechanism, a response to the proximity of large concentrations of life, of warmth, of the density of living things moving through their environment. In the living tree, this produced a faint orange glow, visible at night across the grove when large animals passed through. In the processed, hardened resin, in what traders eventually began calling Elysian amber, the property persisted, not identically, more slowly, more subtly, but present, responsive in its way, fecund to the world around it. The grove on Ilesia's northern continent no longer exists. The industrial operations that the Hutt Kajidics established on Ilesia in the centuries following their initial colonization of the planet altered the northern continent's hydrology. The river system that fed the grove's root structure was redirected to support a processing facility. The trees did not survive the redirection. The survey records from the period describe the grove's decline over approximately 40 years. A slow dying that nobody with the authority to stop it found worth stopping, because the grove's primary economic value was in the harvested amber, not in the living trees themselves. And by the time the trees were dying, the known reserves of processed amber were already adequate for the foreseeable market. The foreseeable market did not foresee everything. The last significant harvest of Ilesian amber was conducted approximately 300 years before the events we are examining. What existed after that harvest was a finite supply. The processed amber, already in circulation, already worked into objects, already distributed across the galaxy in the hands of people who did and did not understand what they had. No new amber has been produced in 3 centuries. None can be. The trees are gone. The grove is gone. The river that fed it has been running in a different direction for so long that the original channel is now just a dry depression in the northern continent's landscape, visible from above, indistinguishable at ground level from any other geographical feature of a planet that has been significantly reorganized. What remains of Ylesian amber is what remains, including one piece, 4 feet long, carved with Hutti's oath marks along its full length, currently in a glass case in a private collection on Coruscant, still warm to the touch, still faintly glowing in the dark. The pipe was made for Jabba's father. This detail appears in a single source, a Hutt antiquities assessment conducted when the pipe passed through a trading post in Mos Eisley after the battle at Carcoon, in the hands of a dealer named Prog, who specialized in Hutt objects and who recognized what he was looking at immediately. Prog's assessment notes, briefly, that the style of the oath marks on the stem is consistent with Desilizhic clan work from the period of Zorba, the Hutt's consolidation approximately 400 years before the events we are examining, and that the scale of the object suggests it was commissioned for a Hutt of significant size, which would place its original owner among the senior generation of the Desilizhic Kajidik from that era. Zorba, the Hutt, Jabba's father. The pipe, if Prog's assessment is correct, was made before Jabba was born. It was in the family, in the clan, in the physical possession of the Desilizhic lineage. Before Jabba existed, he inherited it. Not in the legal sense, necessarily. Hutt inheritance is complicated, and the specific circumstances by which objects pass between generations within a Kajidik are not well documented from the outside. but he came to possess it. At some point in his early development, the pipe became his, in the way that objects become yours when you use them so consistently, across so much time, that the object begins to carry the specific record of your use. We do not know when Jabba first used the pipe. We do not know at what age or in what circumstances it passed into his regular possession. The deep past of Jabba's early life on Nal Hutta and the early years of his establishment on Tatooine is the layer of this story where the record is thinnest, where we have the least material, and where the narrator must be most honest about the gaps. What we know is that by the time the palace was fully established, by the time the throne room was carved out of the Biomar's meditation chamber, and the dais was placed, and the hookah table was built to the left of it, the pipe was already there. Already part of the room's architecture, in the practical sense that its presence was assumed in the room's design. In Hutt culture, the ceremonial pipe is not a simple personal affectation. This point is important enough to dwell on, because the easy reading of the pipe, the reading that the myth of Jabba encourages, is as a prop of excess, an emblem of appetite, something a creature of pure indulgence would naturally possess. The larger, the more ornate, the more expensive the materials, the more perfectly it fits the myth's image of its subject. The actual cultural function of the ceremonial pipe in Hutt oath-making traditions is different and more interesting. In the Hutt commercial and political tradition, which is ancient, going back to the pre-Republic era of Hutt space, when the Khajidics were the primary political units of a civilization that predated galactic standardization, certain categories of agreement required witnessed confirmation, not merely verbal confirmation, not merely written record. A physical act conducted in the presence of all parties that made the agreement material, gave it substance in the room, in the air, in the shared sensory experience of everyone present. The smoke from the ceremonial pipe was that act. When an agreement was reached, a contract, an alliance, a debt established, a debt forgiven, the pipe was lit and the smoke rose, and what was agreed was witnessed by the smoke. This is not mysticism in the conventional sense. It is a practical technology of commitment, a way of making an abstract agreement into a thing that happened, that was present in the room, that everyone who was there can later recall, not just as words exchanged, but as something they experienced. The smoke as memory. Every major negotiation Jabba conducted in that throne room, across decades, happened in the presence of the pipe. Every contract confirmed, every bounty established, every debt acknowledged, every alliance, temporary, conditional, self-interested, but nevertheless real, was made in the amber smoke, witnessed by it, carried forward in whatever it means for smoke to carry something. The Biomar monk, who noted the orange light that thinks it is the sun, was not noting a frivolity. He was noting a record-keeping device, the most significant tool in a room full of tools for managing power. The battle above the pit of Carcoon happened on a specific afternoon in 4 ABY. The katana was a large sail barge, by the standards of Tatooine desert craft, enormous. Its destruction was not quiet. The explosion that ended it was visible from the outskirts of Mos Eisley, and several traders in the market district reported hearing something, a distant concussion that they could not place, but that they recorded in their journals for that day, with the vague unease of people who know something happened but do not yet know what. The pipe was on the barge. It travelled with Jabba as a matter of practice. The significant occasions required it, and an execution in the desert, whatever its other qualities, was a significant occasion. It had been packed and transported to the barge for the journey to Carcoon, as it had been packed and transported to the barge many times before. The explosion destroyed most of what was on the katana. Wood, fabric, metal. Most materials cannot survive the temperatures that a vessel fire produces in those first minutes. What the fire started, the desert continued. The heat of a Tatooine afternoon, working on the wreckage for hours after the initial event. Ylesian amber is not most materials. The physical properties that make it exceptional, the density of the processed resin, the structural integrity achieved through its ancient maturation and harvest process, are properties that apply to heat resistance as directly as to anything else. The amber did not melt. It did not crack. It sat in the burning wreckage of the katana for several hours and emerged when the fires finally reduced to smoldering intact. The oath marks along the stem were still legible. The bioluminescent amber was still warm to the touch, though on that afternoon the warmth of the desert made the pipe's ambient warmth indistinguishable from the world around it. The Jawas arrived 3 days later. A sandcrawler had tracked the plume of smoke from a distance, and the Jawas had done what Jawas do, moved toward it at their own pace, methodical and unhurried, arriving when they arrived, beginning their work without ceremony. The wreckage field was already partially buried, the sand having started its patient redistribution in the 3 days since the explosion. The larger structural components of the katana were fixed in place by their own weight, but the smaller debris had begun to drift. The pipe was recovered from a debris field approximately 40 feet from the main wreckage. The Jawas catalogued it as a Hutt decorative object of uncertain function, assigned it a value based on the quality of the material, which even to Jawa assessment standards was clearly exceptional, and transported it to their sandcrawler for eventual sale. They did not know what it was. They recognized the material as valuable without knowing its name or its origin. The oath marks they probably took for decorative carving, which in a sense they are, but decoration and record keeping are not always separable categories. They sold it in Mos Eisley approximately 2 weeks later, at their regular market position near the eastern docking bay. Prog, the antiquities dealer, was at the market that day by chance. He was there to purchase something else, a set of Rhodian navigation charts that turned out, on inspection, to be poorly reproduced copies of no particular value. Disappointed, moving through the Jawa sale, looking for anything worth his time, he saw the pipe and stopped. He held it for several minutes at the market stall, turning it in his hands. The oath marks, the scale, the quality of the amber, which he recognized as Ylesian, a material he had handled perhaps 3 times in his career, and that he had not expected to encounter in a Jawa sale. He asked where it came from. The Jawas gestured toward the desert in a direction that, he later noted in his assessment, corresponded with the approximate location of the Carcoon event he had heard about secondhand. He paid the Jawas their asking price without negotiating. This is, for anyone who knows Jawa market culture and Prog's professional reputation, the most significant detail in his account of the acquisition. Prog negotiated everything. It was his professional identity and his personal pleasure simultaneously. He negotiated the price of his morning meal. He negotiated transit fees that were already fixed by posted schedule. The fact that he paid the Jawas their first number without a single counter is a precise and unrepeated measure of how clearly he understood what he was holding. He kept the pipe in his back room for 6 months, wrapped in cloth, before he sold it. He described the 6 months in a conversation with a colleague, recorded in that colleague's memoirs, as thinking time. He was deciding who should have it, not whether to sell it. He eventually sold it to a collection broker who moved objects of Hutt significance to buyers in the core worlds. The broker sold it within 3 months to the private collector on Coruscant. The collector's name is not relevant. He is a person who accumulated things from the Outer Rim in the years following the fall of the Empire, partly as investment, partly as what he described to friends as historical witness. He wanted the record of a world that was changing. He wanted to own pieces of what had been. He knew the pipe was Jabba's. This was part of what he paid for. The provenance, the confirmed attribution, the ability to tell guests what they were looking at. He kept it in a room with other such objects. A set of Gamorrean guard armor, decommissioned and cleaned. A navigational instrument from a destroyed smuggling vessel. A piece of durasteel hull plating from a craft whose history he had traced with considerable effort and was proud of. On his first night with the pipe, he entered the room after the rest of the apartment had gone dark and found it glowing. Not brightly, not dramatically. A faint, deep orange, the color of something seen through closed eyelids when a warm light is on the other side. It came from within the amber, from the material itself, not from any surface reflection. He stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then he went inside and stood next to the case and looked at it. The glow was steady, not flickering, not responsive to his presence, or at least not in any way he could detect. He had 2 materials scientists examine it over the following months. Both noted the bioluminescent property. Neither could account for its persistence in a processed material of this age. One suggested a possible crystalline structure within the amber that could be storing and slowly releasing ambient light energy. The other suggested the phenomenon was too consistent for that explanation and offered nothing better. Both noted that it was, whatever its mechanism, not harmful and not a defect. The collector accepted this and moved on. Objects have properties. This one had this property. He learned to find it pleasant. The room in the dark, the faint amber glow, the sense of something quietly present in a collection of quiet presences. The narrator has been withholding an explanation. It was withheld because the explanation lands differently after you have held the object for a while, after you know where it came from and what it passed through to get here. An explanation offered too early becomes a fact. An explanation offered after the weight of the object has been felt becomes something else. The Willesian amber bioluminesces in the presence of a significant concentration of life energy. This was the function of the living trees. This is what the bioluminescence was for. Not decoration, not accident, but biological attention. The trees were responding to the world around them. Large animals passing through the grove. The density of living things in proximity. The warmth of bodies moving through the dark. In a room full of objects gathered from across the galaxy, each one with its history, each one having passed through many hands, each one carrying in its material structure the record of what it encountered. The amber continues doing what it was built to do. It is attending to what surrounds it. It is making light in response to the accumulated presence of things that were once alive, that touched living hands, that moved through living rooms. The Gamorrean armor, the smuggler's instrument, the hull plating, the pipe itself, which was present at hundreds of oaths, made by living beings in a room that held the weight of their agreements. The Bomar monk described it as the orange light that thinks it is the sun. The monk was noting a sensory impression without explaining it, which is what the Bomar did. They recorded what reached them without imposing interpretation on what they could not verify. But there is something in the phrase that the narrator wants to leave with the listener, because it is more accurate than the monk could have known. The sun makes light in response to what it is, an enormous concentration of energy, pressing outward, illuminating whatever is in proximity. The amber makes light in response to what surrounds it, a smaller, quieter version of the same attention. Both are, in their way, witnesses, one to the solar system, one to a room on Coruscant, where the city blazes on the other side of the glass, and the collector sleeps, and the history of the outer rim sits in glass cases, still warm. The pipe was present at the making of hundreds of oaths. The pipe is present now, only in a room that contains many things, making its light. There is something about objects that hold this kind of accumulated witness that is difficult to articulate in any calendar system, in any language, in any framework that measures time the way living creatures measure time. The pipe does not know that Jabba is dead. The pipe does not know that the throne room is empty, that the grooves in the floor hold nothing heavier than the air above them now, that the smell of amber smoke is all that remains of the agreements the smoke once witnessed. The pipe knows, in the only way an object can know anything, that it is in the presence of things, that there is life warmth nearby, that something is worth attending to. It attends. The next fragment is about a person who attended also, who was in that throne room for decades, who watched the pipe lit and carried and used, who tried to learn from the watching what the watching was teaching, and who found, at the end of all that attendance, that what he had been watching was not exactly what he had thought. The two accounts of how Bib Fortuna came to be in Jabba's service cannot both be true. The first account, the one Fortuna himself preferred, in the sense that it appears in the versions of his history that he offered when he had some control over the telling, describes a young Twi'lek from the city of Lesu on Ryloth, who had been working as a mid-level operative in one of Ryloth's domestic criminal networks, and who, following a series of events he described with deliberate vagueness as a professional complication, found it necessary to leave Ryloth quickly and permanently. He made his way to Tatooine. He sought out Jabba's organization because it was the largest and most stable employer of people with his particular skills in the region. He presented himself. He was hired. In this version, Fortuna is an agent. He makes a choice. He arrives on his own terms. The second account, which appears in two independent sources, neither of them sympathetic to Fortuna, describes a debt. A Twi'lek merchant on Ryloth had accumulated obligations to a Desiligic intermediary operating in the Ryloth spice trade, and when the debt came due and the merchant could not pay it in credits, the settlement took a different form. A young member of the merchant's household, a nephew in one account, a ward in the other, was transferred as part of the arrangement. Transferred not in the legal sense of sale, but in the practical sense of a life redirected without being consulted on its new direction. In this version, Fortuna does not choose. He arrives because someone else decided he would arrive. The narrator presents both accounts because both have survived, and because the survival of contradictory accounts is itself information. Someone, at some point, had reason to establish the voluntary version as the preferred version. The resources to make that version more accessible than the alternative suggest a level of control over one's own record that is consistent with decades of information management, which is to say, consistent with Fortuna. The voluntary account has the marks of a story that was constructed carefully by someone who understood that the story of how you begin shapes how people interpret everything that comes after. What this tells us about Fortuna, before he has done anything, before we have examined a single year of his actual service, is that he understood from very early that narrative was a tool, that the account of a thing and the thing itself were not the same. and that controlling the account was a form of power available even to people who did not yet have any other kind. This is something he learned. The question is from whom? Fortuna's earliest documented appearances in the administrative records of Jabba's organization place him in logistical roles, coordinating supply deliveries, managing the schedules of various personnel, handling the correspondence that required a degree of literacy in multiple languages that not all of Jabba's staff possessed. He was, by these records, competent, reliable in the specific way that people are reliable, when they understand that unreliability in their position carries consequences they cannot afford. He was also, from an early stage, observant in a way that went beyond the requirements of his job. A trader who dealt regularly with Jabba's organization in the period of Fortuna's early service, his account preserved in a collection of Outer Rim merchant memoirs compiled decades later, describes Fortuna as someone who was always slightly more present than the situation required, who attended meetings he was not strictly needed at, who positioned himself in rooms where decisions were being made, contributing nothing, saying nothing, simply being there. The trader found this mildly unsettling at the time, in the way that attentive silence can be unsettling when you are not sure what it is attending to. What it was attending to was Jabba. Not exclusively, Fortuna watched everyone, in the way that people watch when they are building a comprehensive map of a social environment and need to understand every relationship, every dependency, every point of leverage in the system. But Jabba was the center of the map, and Fortuna's attention returned to that center continuously, the way a compass needle returns to north, regardless of how many times you rotate it. He was learning. The question, and this is the question the narrator wants to hold carefully, because the answer to it shapes everything that follows, is what he was learning, what he was taking from all those years of watching, what the watching gave him and what it failed to give him, despite all his patience and all his attention. Here is what Fortuna learned. He learned that information asymmetry was the primary tool of organizational control. Jabba always knew more than the person he was speaking with knew that he knew. He knew about their debts, their fears, their dependencies, their histories. He knew which of his own lieutenants were communicating with each other outside official channels and what they were communicating about. He knew which of his suppliers were skimming and by how much, and whether the amount was worth addressing or more useful as held leverage. He had assembled, across decades, a comprehensive map of everyone in his environment. And the map was a weapon available to be deployed at the moment of maximum effect. Fortuna learned this. He began, in his own sphere of operation, to assemble his own maps, to collect information about the people around him, their vulnerabilities, their alliances, their private concerns, and to hold that information in reserve. He became, over years, genuinely skilled at this. The people who worked under him understood that Fortuna knew things about them, even if they were not always sure what he knew or how he knew it. The uncertainty was the point. You cannot fully calculate the risk of a particular action when you don't know the dimensions of the information held against you. He learned the performance of composure. Jabba was never visibly shaken. This was partly a function of Hutt physiology. The specific kind of body Jabba had did not produce the visible stress responses that many other species displayed, did not flush or flinch or tighten in ways a trained observer could read. But it was also partly deliberate. Jabba had cultivated an exterior that revealed nothing he did not intend to reveal, and Fortuna, who observed this across years, developed his own version. The Twi'lek equivalent The careful control of leku movement, which in an unwary Twi'lek will telegraph emotion as clearly as a face, became, in Fortuna, a disciplined neutrality. He trained himself out of the automatic responses. He built a surface. He learned the value of making people wait. Jabba made people wait for audiences, for responses, for decisions that could have been made quickly but were held deliberately, because waiting taught the person, waiting something about their own relationship to the one they were waiting for. Fortuna adopted this. He made people wait for him. He understood that the management of time in an organization like this one was a form of hierarchy made physical and temporal. These are real skills. The narrator wants to be clear about this. Fortuna was not a fool. He was not a simple imitator producing a transparent copy. He observed carefully, he extracted genuine principles, and he applied them with real competence across decades of service, and then, after Jabba's death, in his own attempts at consolidation. What he learned was real. It was also incomplete in a specific way that no amount of additional observation could have corrected. Here is what Fortuna did not learn. He did not learn patience in the foundational sense, not patience as a technique, which he managed adequately, but patience as a relationship to outcomes, as a genuine comfort with the unresolved. Jabba could hold competing pressures without forcing resolution. He could have two allies who hated each other and manage them both without making them choose, because he understood that the tension between them was a resource rather than a problem. He could be owed a debt and not collect it for years, because the uncollected debt was worth more as held leverage than it would be as a recovered payment. He could watch an opposition network operate against him for 2 years without acting, because the watching was more valuable than the disrupting. He could let an offer be declined in Anchorhead without punishment, because the punishment would cost more attention than the offense was worth in a month of recalibrating spice routes. This capacity to hold things open, to leave resolutions unmade, to be genuinely comfortable with the pressure of unresolved situations pressing against each other, was not a technique Jabba had learned. It was, the narrator suspects, a feature of how he was built, a product of Hutt lifespan and Hutt metabolism and something else that is harder to name. A relationship to time itself that was different from the relationship most shorter-lived species have. Hutts live for centuries. The ordinary Hutt lifespan, barring violence or accident, extends to 900 years or more. Jabba, at his death, was 600 years old. Not old for a Hutt by any means, but old in the sense of having lived long enough that a decade was a different unit of time than it is for a human, or a Twi'lek, or a Bothan. What felt to his adversaries like patience was, from Jabba's perspective, simply ordinary tempo. He was not waiting heroically. He was waiting at the natural pace of an entity for whom 10 years was not a large portion of a life. Fortuna was Twi'lek. Twi'leks live, under ordinary circumstances, approximately 90 years. He had been watching Jabba for decades, and in those decades, he had assembled a sophisticated technical understanding of how Jabba managed his organization. But he had assembled it with a Twi'lek's relationship to time, one in which decades are significant, in which an unresolved situation feels like pressure, in which the urge to act is a natural response to the accumulation of tension. He had learned the forms of patience. He had not learned the ground from which they grew. When Jabba waited, he was doing something that came naturally. When Fortuna waited, he was holding himself back. The difference between these two things is enormous, and it is invisible from the outside. Both look to an observer like a figure who is not acting when action is possible. but one is stillness and one is restraint, and they produce completely different results when the waiting ends. The years after Jabba's death were, for Fortuna, a demonstration of this difference. He attempted to consolidate the palace's operations. In the immediate aftermath, this was not unreasonable. He had been the major domo. He knew the organization's structure. He had relationships with most of the significant parties. He had, in the administrative sense, been running the day-to-day operations for years. The consolidation was the obvious next step. He could not hold it. Not because he was opposed by a single, overwhelming rival, although there were rivals, and their opposition was real, but because he was making, in the narrator's assessment, the specific error that comes from having learned forms without foundations. He was managing, actively, continuously, with visible effort, where Jabba had simply been. He was resolving tensions that Jabba would have left in productive suspension. He was collecting debts that Jabba would have held as leverage. He was acting consistently and urgently, where Jabba would have waited. Each action was, individually, defensible. Some of them were correct, but the cumulative effect of continuous action in an organization that had been built on a foundation of strategic patience was the gradual erosion of what had made the organization coherent. The alliances that had been held in creative tension began to collapse. The rivals who had been neutralized by information asymmetry began to probe when they realized the information was no longer being managed with the same comprehensive attention. The subordinates who had been kept competitive by careful hierarchy management began to consolidate against him when they realized the hierarchy was no longer held by someone who genuinely outclassed them. He held the organization for years, in various forms, and with various degrees of control. He was not incompetent. He was not easily defeated. But he was always managing, always acting, always responding. And the thing that was eating him was not any single enemy, but the simple fact that you cannot maintain through effort what was built through nature. You can imitate the surface of a river, but you cannot imitate the spring. The narrator heard, through the kind of indirect channel that outer rim information often travels through, an account of Fortuna in the throne room. It was not long after the battle at Carcoon, sometime in those first weeks, before the organization had fully understood its own condition. A guard who was in the palace during this period, who left Fortuna's service within the year and ended up in a different employment arrangement entirely, whose account reached the narrator through 3 sets of hands and should be held accordingly, described finding Fortuna alone in the throne room in the middle of the night. Fortuna was on the dais, not standing, seated or as close to seated as Twi'lek physiology permits in a space not designed for Twi'lek proportions. The dais had been built for Jabba. It fit Jabba. Fortuna, on it, looked like a person sitting in a chair that was too large for them in every dimension. The guard said that Fortuna was not doing anything, was not reading or reviewing records or conducting any visible business, was simply sitting there in the dark, looking at the room. The guard backed away and did not announce himself and did not mention it to anyone at the time. What Fortuna was doing, the narrator cannot know. What he was thinking, what he was looking at, what he was hoping to find by sitting in that space in the dark. These are interior things, and interior things are precisely what we do not have access to. We have the forms. We have the surface. We have what Fortuna chose to show and what others chose to record. The grooves in the floor, the hook marks in the ceiling, the faint smell of amber smoke in the stone. A room designed to make everyone who entered it feel the specific weight of the thing that occupied the center. Fortuna occupied the center, and the room, the guard said, still felt empty. The version of Jabba that the galaxy built in the years that followed would not have recognized itself in that empty feeling. The myth does not accommodate absence. It accommodates presence, overwhelming and grotesque and finally defeated. What the empty throne room held was not the myth. It was the gap between what the myth needed and what was actually there. We need to look at the myth now. We need to understand what it was built from and what it was built for and what, in the building of it, was lost. And we need to ask, quietly, whether the version the galaxy decided to remember would have fit anyone at all, or whether it was built from the beginning not to describe a person but to replace one. Myths are not lies. This is the first thing the narrator wants to establish, because the argument that follows is sometimes mistaken for a defense, and it is not a defense. A myth is a particular kind of truth, the truth of what a community needs to believe about itself and its history in order to continue functioning. Myths simplify, they compress, they select the details that serve the story the community requires, and they set aside the details that complicate it. This is not malicious, usually. It is the natural operation of collective memory working under pressure, trying to make sense of events that are too large and too messy to be held whole. The myth of Jabba the Hutt was built under considerable pressure. The New Republic was constructed in the immediate aftermath of a galactic civil war that had lasted decades and had cost, by any honest accounting, an enormous and still uncounted number of lives. The people building it were people who had survived that war, who had made choices during it, who had lost people during it, who were now tasked with the project of turning a military victory into a functioning government without very many models for how to do that, and without the luxury of time to figure it out slowly. They needed coherent stories. They needed a history of the war that explained why it was worth fighting, why the right side won, why the galaxy was better now than it had been before. These are not unreasonable things to need. Governance requires narrative. People require narrative. The question is not whether you tell the story, but how honestly you tell it and what you do when the evidence doesn't cooperate. The evidence, in the case of Jabba, did not cooperate. The New Republic Historical Documentation Bureau, established in 5 ABY, 1 year after the Battle of Endor, produced its first comprehensive account of Outer Rim criminal infrastructure in 7 ABY. The document was intended as a reference resource for administrators working in the newly incorporated Outer Rim territories. It was also, and the two functions were not separable, a narrative document, a story about what the Outer Rim had been and what it now, under New Republic administration, was in the process of becoming. The section on the Desilij Kajidich and Jabba's operation is 23 pages. The narrator has read it carefully, several times. It is not a document written by people who were trying to deceive. This is important to establish. The officials who compiled it were, by all available evidence, working in good faith with the sources available to them. They interviewed survivors of Jabba's organization. They reviewed imperial records from the Outer Rim territories. They collected testimony from traders and moisture farmers and residents of Mos Espa and Mos Eisley who had lived under Jabba's operational umbrella for decades. The document they produced is wrong in specific ways that are more revealing than random error would be. The first error is the characterization of Jabba as primarily impulsive, as a figure whose decisions were driven by immediate appetite rather than strategic calculation. The evidence for this characterization, as the document presents it, She comes primarily from accounts of Jabba's entertainments, the executions in the throne room, the rancor pit, the elaborate punishments visited on those who failed or betrayed him. These accounts are real. They describe real events. People were fed to the rancor. People were thrown into the pit of Carcoon. The entertainments were genuine, and they were genuinely cruel, and they are part of what Jabba was. But the document treats the entertainments as the primary evidence of character, as the most revealing expression of how Jabba operated, and does not engage seriously with the mountain of contradictory evidence available in the same record. The Bith information broker, who was watched for 2 years before being caught and then released with a calibrated warning. This is not an impulsive response. The Bothan's spies network that was systematically redirected over 14 months. This is not an appetite for immediate resolution. The Imperial Moff's assessment that waiting was Jabba's primary strategic weapon. This is not the description of a creature of impulse. The document contains these cases, or versions of them. They are in the record. And the document accounts for them by treating them as anomalies, exceptions to the general character, evidence of occasional cunning that does not alter the fundamental assessment. The narrator wants to be precise. When your exceptions consistently contradict your rule, the problem is the rule. The second error is the characterization of Jabba's organization as held together exclusively by fear. This one is more understandable, because fear was genuinely a significant element of the organization's maintenance. People who worked for Jabba knew what happened to people who failed him seriously or betrayed him comprehensively. The fear was real, and it was functional, and it was, in many documented cases, the reason a particular individual made a particular choice. The document's characterization is not fabricated, but exclusive is the word that fails. The document does not acknowledge, cannot, in the narrative it is constructing, acknowledge the web of mutual interest that ran through the organization alongside the fear. Jabba had relationships with specific smugglers that lasted decades, not because those smugglers had no options, not because they were too frightened to go elsewhere, because the arrangement was, for them, genuinely advantageous. Better routes, better protection, better rates than they could get from the organizations that competed with Jabba's operation. The logistics networks that kept Jabba's spice trade running were staffed by people who had the skills to work for other employers, and who, by any reasonable analysis, chose not to. The informant networks that gave Jabba his comprehensive situational picture were maintained by individuals who were paid well in several documented cases over many years, and who continued providing information because the compensation was reliable. Fear was one tool in the organization's maintenance. Interest was another. Habit was a third. The specific comfort of knowing exactly where you stood, exactly what was expected, exactly what the consequences of deviation would be, was, for many people in the Outer Rim's unstable environment, not a negligible benefit. The myth requires fear alone, because a story about a monster sustained by mutual interest is a harder story to tell. A monster that people chose to work with, that offered something real in exchange for what it took, is a more uncomfortable entity than one that held everything by terror. The myth smooths this difficulty away. The document does not say that nobody benefited from Jabba's organization, but it does not say clearly that many people did, and that their benefits were real, and that the removal of the organization removed those benefits along with the fear. 15 years of Tatooine's economic condition is the evidence that the document could not have consulted, because it had not yet accumulated when the document was written. But it is the evidence that the myth's characterization most completely fails to anticipate. The third error is the one the narrator finds most significant, and it is the one that connects most directly to the object sitting in a glass case on Coruscant. The myth's Jabba is not bound by anything. This is not stated explicitly in the Historical Documentation Bureau's report. It does not need to be stated explicitly because it is structural. It is built into the way every element of the account is framed. The myth's Jabba makes no genuine agreements. He does not honor contracts. He does not maintain obligations. He takes what he wants, and what he has promised to do in exchange for what he takes is a performance, a temporary mimicry of commitment, sustained only until it is no longer convenient and then abandoned without cost. So the pipe is the evidence against this characterization. Not only the pipe is the physical artifact of the evidence, the object that carries the practice, but the practice itself, which is documented across enough independent sources that it cannot be dismissed as anomaly. Jabba used the ceremonial pipe consistently across decades at the establishment of significant agreements. The Hutt custom of oath-making with witness smoke is not a superstition. It is a technology of commitment, a way of making obligations material and memorable and shared. You use it when you intend the obligation to be real. You use it when you understand yourself as bound by what you are agreeing to. The narrator has found, across the records of Jabba's operation, multiple instances where Jabba honored agreements when honoring them was not the path of least resistance, where collecting on a debt would have been easier than maintaining the relationship the debt existed within, where breaking a contract would have been profitable in the short term and was not broken. These are not numerous enough to construct a portrait of Jabba as an entity of scrupulous principle. He was not. But they are numerous enough to establish that he operated within a system of obligations that he took seriously, selectively and strategically, but genuinely, and that this system was anchored in something older than his own organization, older than his own life, even. The Hutti's oath-making tradition is pre-Republic, reaching back into the deep history of Hutt civilization, and Jabba, who was 600 years old and who spent his last week reading old Deciligic clan records, was embedded in that history in ways that the myth simply has no framework for. The myth's Jabba cannot use a ceremonial pipe for oath-making, because the myth's Jabba does not make oaths he intends to keep. The pipe in the myth becomes what the myth needs it to be, a prop of excess, a luxury object, an emblem of appetite. The pipe in the evidence is something else, a tool of obligation, an instrument of witness, an object that carries, in its Elysian amber and its carved oath marks, the accumulated record of hundreds of agreements that were, at the moment of their making, meant to be kept. These two versions of the pipe cannot coexist. The myth chose one. The evidence shows the other. Who needed the myth to be true? This is the question the narrator has been building toward, and it requires a careful answer because the honest answer is complicated. The rebellion needed it, not cynically, not as a calculated political deception, but genuinely. The people who had fought and lost people and survived the long years of the Galactic Civil War needed the story of their victory to be clean. They needed Jabba to be a monster, because they had aligned themselves with people who dealt with Jabba, who used his resources and his networks and his information. And the cleanest way to hold that alliance and the moral clarity of the rebellion's cause simultaneously was to understand Jabba as something outside the moral framework rather than within it. A monster is not a political actor. A monster is not someone you made compromises with. A monster is simply removed. The New Republic needed it for different reasons. Reasons of governance rather than psychology. The Outer Rim was a territory the New Republic was now responsible for, and the Outer Rim was a mess. Centuries of Republic neglect, followed by years of Imperial extraction, followed by the collapse of the criminal infrastructure that had, however, brutally provided certain organizing functions. This was not a simple administrative challenge. The myth of Jabba as a pure parasite, whose removal was unambiguously beneficial, was necessary to the New Republic's self-presentation as a liberating force in the Outer Rim. If Jabba had been, among other things, the closest thing to governance many Outer Rim communities had ever had, if his removal had left a wound as well as a liberation, then the New Republic's responsibility for what came after was much larger and much more uncomfortable than the myth allowed. It is easier to celebrate the removal of a monster than to administer what the monster's removal left behind. The myth protected the New Republic from having to reckon fully with what it had inherited. What was lost when the myth replaced the person? Not sympathy. The narrator is not asking the listener to feel sympathy for Jabba. The evidence does not support a sympathetic reading. It supports a complicated one, which is different. Sympathy requires identification. Complication requires only honesty. What was lost was the actual shape of the problem, the actual dimensions of what the Outer Rim was and how it worked and why. By replacing the complicated person with the simple monster, the myth also replaced the complicated reality with a simple story, one in which the Outer Rim's problems were the product of a specific evil presence now removed, rather than the product of structural conditions that the presence had exploited and that persisted after the exploitation ended. 15 years later, in 19 ABY, the Mos Espa market closes early. The moisture farmers pay 3 tithes for no reliable protection. The routes are contested. The stones are shifting in the wall. The myth did not produce these conditions, but the myth protected the people responsible for addressing them from understanding, clearly and early, what they were dealing with. The monster story had an ending. The monster died, and the story was over, and what came next was recovery. The complicated story does not have that ending. The complicated story continues. The complicated story is still being written. The gap between the myth and the person is not symmetric. This is the last thing the narrator wants to observe before moving to the next fragment. The myth emphasizes appetite. The evidence emphasizes patience. These are nearly opposite qualities. The myth emphasizes impulsiveness. The evidence emphasizes strategic calculation. These are directly contradictory. The myth emphasizes that Jabba was not bound by anything, not by obligation, not by agreement, not by any principle beyond immediate want. The evidence shows an entity who used an ancient oath-making instrument at every significant agreement across decades of operation, who honored obligations when honoring them served the larger architecture of his relationships, who was embedded in a tradition of Hutt obligation that is as old as any surviving institutional tradition in the galaxy. These contradictions are not random. They are consistent in a specific direction. The myth consistently describes qualities that make Jabba's defeat feel inevitable and just, and those qualities consistently turn out to be the opposite of what the evidence shows. The myth required a creature of pure appetite, because appetite does not strategize. The myth required impulsiveness, because impulsiveness makes mistakes. So the myth required an entity unbound by obligation, because an entity bound by nothing is an entity that deserves nothing. No consideration, no acknowledgement that its removal costs something. The gap between the myth and the person is widest precisely where the myth is most insistent. This is, the narrator suggests, not a coincidence. It is what a necessary story looks like. And the next fragment examines one specific moment where the necessary story produced specific, consequential consequences, where a particular misreading of a particular decision shaped how the galaxy responded to Jabba in his final years, and what that misreading missed, and what it could not see, and what was already moving through its blind spot toward its conclusion.